Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I'm Pascal Ravsou from the FHH, and we are now talking about women power. It's the second panel about women's watches or men's watches. Well, actually, we're going to debate that with Victoria Gomelsky. I'll leave you with Victoria in expert hands. Victoria, please.
I feel like this is now on, yes? Feels a little loud. Am I too loud? Okay. Sorry, we're going to iron out our technical difficulties. Well, we can certainly pass this one around. No. Well, we got a hot mic here. We can do this one. Sorry, give us 2 seconds. We'll square this away. All right, it's all me. I'll just talk your ears off over here. Well, I'll start just about 2 decades, which is a scary long time. And I know all these lovely people from various trade shows and experiences we've had together. You're at the panel that is called What's Yours is Mine, What's Mine is Yours, and we're talking about really gender and watches. And I think it's a perfect moment to have this conversation. It feels like you know, this conversation about are we in a post-gender society and is it time to retire labels, men's watches, women's watches, is this passé? And I think we have the four perfect panelists to discuss this. To my right is Hyla Bauer. She's a longtime watch journalist, former Condé Nast editor and editor-in-chief of Watch Journal. We've got Sophy Rindler to Hyla's right. She is head of Red Bar Miami, a co-founder of the watch brand Talker, and also a contributor with True Facet, or
contributor. Yes, that's a good word.
Is it a good word? Yeah, she can clarify. To Sophie's right is Michael Friedman, head of complications and a longtime former historian at Audemars Piguet. He's a font of knowledge, so we'll get a great historical perspective from Michael. And last but certainly not least, we've got Nick Sullivan, fashion director of Esquire. So let's just kick this off with a very simple question. How do you all define a men's watch versus a woman's watch? Do you even think that way? Or do you just look at timepieces as simply a watch, and then if it's more masculine looking, you perhaps think it's bought by men, and if it's more feminine, it's sort of positioned for women? I mean, how do you each sort of look at the watch world? Do you separate it in that way?
I would have to say that some watches definitely speak more to women, most women in general. I have an example. I'm wearing a very small Boucheron on this wrist, and I'm wearing a larger Rolex on this wrist. This would traditionally be a man's watch. Oh, sorry. And so I feel like it's kind of up to the individual person who's buying the watch. Like, okay, I'm a man or I'm a woman, but you want to buy what you love. And so I think there's a lot of marketing to men and to women, and a lot of watches are very traditionally for men and for women. But I think with the conversation that we're having in the society at large, I think these kinds of delineations will disappear over time.
Well, I think there are codes that exist that are more geared toward women or towards men, but I think that today we're breaking the codes, and I'm stealing that from AP. And I think it's a mistake. I think that it should be more yellow and less pink and blue. That's my take on it for now.
Yeah, along what you guys said, it's design codes. It's masculine and feminine more than men and women. And there's a lot of men's watches which are steeped in feminine codes, and there's a lot of women's watches that are steeped in men's codes. And then there's those that are just entirely, it's a matter of choice. It's a matter of options. As you said, a woman can buy any watch they want on the market. A woman could buy any aspect of fashion as well. Like even in the fashion side, there's much more choices. With men, it's a little more limiting in that sense. But even along those lines, diamond set and gem set watches, which were traditionally something that women would only buy are now being purchased more and more by men. So we're really seeing this adoption of codes, and it's really a reflection of the origin of watches as well. Back in the 16th century, when watches first emerged, they were it was never distinguished between men and women. It was a matter of cost basis and affordability. There was no distinction at that point. And in many respects, we're starting to return to that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, I speak as one who has probably got the least qualifications to speak here, because when I go to Geneva in January, I have one day to do everybody. So the opening conversation is bonjour, don't show me pens, children's tourbillons, women's watches, or any of the other stuff, just men's, because with the best will in the world, I've got 18 minutes and then I'm off. And so I never see any. But I realize actually, because what we've been saying is that it really depends on the individual. I think there is a big factor, which I hope we'll talk about, which is what the companies are thinking about when they think about their watches. Is more critical to this than what the customers think about. And I do think customers are put off if they're marketed to in a masculine way, or if they're marketed in an overtly feminine way. I think that's a cue to someone saying that the watch is not for me. And so that it's about how the industry thinks about the watches it's producing is more critical than what the customer's thinking about. But you know, I see many watches that I wear myself. Most of my watches are probably a bit more on the masculine side, but I like a Cartier Tank occasionally, and that's my holiday from tool watches. And honestly, I'm not entirely comfortable with wearing it on a daily basis, but I do on special occasions. But that's just me, and I'm an individual, just like everybody else. So, you know, it's really a case of this industry is evolving so fast. I think one of the mistakes that companies are making is that they're relying on sort of guessing on data. They think they've got data to prove that the kids are into gender fluid clothes, and there is data that kids are much more overtly they're not put off by it, or they're not fazed by it. Does that mean they're going to buy it exactly the way you put it out there because you've read in a Instagram report that everybody likes gender fluid things? And I think there's a little bit of too much trying to target an idea that came out across a boardroom table, and not enough gut and not enough of the traditional sense of great products.
Right, no, excellent point. And one of the things we chatted about before we started this was this idea that, you know, companies themselves will label their products a men's piece or a women's piece, or they'll have a category that's a women's category. But so when those watches sell, you know, piece that may be labeled a men's piece sells to a woman, they don't really have a way of accounting for that. So, you know, their own data is sort of flawed because they're selling watches that they've labeled themselves, but they're not accounting for the fact that they're being, that their customers are sort of mixing them up really at retail. I think of certain brands that are, you know, really clearly associated with one sort of either a masculine look or a feminine look. I think of IWC, which for years went with the tagline "Engineered for Men," which I think they retired a few years ago as they began to make a push on, you know, to capture a really untapped marketplace, which was women buying their watches, or perhaps not yet buying their watches. Can you think of, I mean, do you think that this, you know, there are some brands that do the sort of unisex approach better than others? I mean, are there some brands that you think would never kind of cross those gender boundaries in a way that feels authentic? I mean, IWC comes to mind, perhaps, just for years it associated itself with machines for men.
Well, I think one of the problems is that so many of the watches that we're talking about here, it depends whether you're talking about what we call tool watches, which derive from sort of some sort of military function. By the nature of the history of that military thing, it sort of naturally makes people think towards that. Now, there are women flying F-16s in the US Air Force now. I don't see that cropping up so often in an ad campaign from a tool watch brand, and that's the responsibility is on them to make that change. But I can understand that it comes from a historical thing. You're talking about dive watches, you're talking about you know, flying watches, you name it. It is not true that women don't do those things, but it was true a long time ago. But this industry is not known for being like about changing. So So I think, you know, there is a need for an evolution, and I think you have to make some sort of positive step, but it has to come from the brands.
Agreed. Michael, do you have any thoughts on sort of brands that, you know, are associated with one kind of, you know, one half of this equation versus the other? I mean, are there some that just would never feel right, you know, as a women's piece because they've got such a long history as a men's brand?
I think the brands are starting to really look internally to challenge themselves to do so. I mean, Bulgari is a good example. They were so associated with women's watches, and that's shifted drastically over the last few years with some of their great new releases. I think Audemars Piguet was the brand I'm with was associated with men's because of the strength of the offshore. And the vast majority of watches that we produce now are consciously produced simultaneously both for men and women. Whether it's the new release of Code 1159 or a 38 millimeter Royal Oak, there's absolutely no label on these watches whatsoever. Our 37 millimeters sell to lots of men in certain parts of the world. Our 41 millimeters sell to some women in the Upper East Side of New York City who want to be able to read the dial. They want a bigger watch. They're getting older. There's so much fluidity there. And we also have to look at the key designers themselves. You know, let's start with Gerald Genta, the Royal Oak, the Nautilus, so on and so forth. Genta, people have this association that these are men's watches, but Genta was a designer of women's watches as much as men's watches, and the Royal Oak, as well as the Nautilus, are flooded with female design codes. All of those polishing techniques on those watches are derived from an influence of Art Deco women's watches. It's overt, but people don't always consciously know that or consciously see that. As soon as you start looking at detail and decoration and finishing and polishing, these are all codes from jewelry that have been co-opted by watchmaking over the last century. So it's much more fluid even when we're not conscious of that aspect.
Great point.
Well, I think that when you talk about tool watches, what was true maybe 20, 30 years ago is not true anymore. A tool watch is going to be worn by a woman today. So I can't think, maybe except for a few independent, like maybe Max Busser, like a really big, massive watches that are hard to wear by a woman. I think I would not be able to wear a watch
Agreed.
like this.
Yeah.
But other than that, I think all those watches that have more conventional shapes, even if they're a little bigger than what you would traditionally associate with a women's watch, are today completely unisex.
Yeah, Rolex Daytona is a great example.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just a men's watch for so much of its history, and now I see Daytonas on women's wrists as often, sometimes more often than on men's watches. On men's
Rolex in
wrists.
general. I mean, Hyla, you're wearing, what's your...
So I'm wearing a Rolex that's a 36 millimeter, so sort of right on the border of men's or women's size. And then on my left wrist, I'm wearing a Boucheron, which is a very small watch, so that's definitely created for women. But when this watch was created in the 70s, this was about the right size for men. So, and I feel comfortable wearing either of these, you know. I don't usually wear them at the same time, but I did today. So it's, for a woman, I think it's how you feel. Definitely a lot of the brands have very divided men's and women's, and I think that can be off-putting, as you were saying, for a man who might actually really like a diamond bezel and a woman who might actually really want to have a real diving watch. Yeah.
I had an interesting conversation just earlier today with a heritage director for one of the big brands down here, and he mentioned something, and I want you guys all to comment on it because it just was an insight I hadn't really thought about. He said that for a men's collection to be successful, and let me remind you, he was representing one of the large groups, not an independent watchmaker, not a really micro brand, a really well-known, you know, part of the Richemont group. And he said for a men's collection to be successful today, it has to have some vintage element to it, something that looks back to the past. And he explained that by saying that, you know, men really care about value, and one way to judge value is to see how a product or a line has performed over years, and if it hasn't performed, and it's not as attractive to men because they're interested in watches as investment pieces, versus women who don't really care about whether something has a link to the past. They care more about its design, its aesthetic, how it feels. And that was an interesting distinction to make, and I wonder if you guys could comment on that. Do you feel that that's a sort of appropriate way to look at sort of how to introduce a new collection, that for men it has to have some
No,
element
I
of vintage.
completely 100% disagree with that.
Okay.
Like, I don't see the logic behind this, because what about independent brands? What about micro brands? What about all these creative
Sophie,
designs?
That's exactly it. This was somebody from a publicly traded
Exactly. We're
entity.
talking about corporate, like,
Yeah.
let's stick to the frame, and it's wrong, and it's a wrong message, in my opinion. I would love to have him on the panel and talk to him. I mean, of course, it was a man, right?
It was a man, indeed.
I think there is a. I tend to sort of, in some way, I can understand it, and if I think I know who you're talking about, I can get it, because they've just woken up to that, and so that's their thing right now. But I also wonder, and this is a question more than an answer, the number of times when I have seen women's watches and I've had them explained to me, and they are sold to me as if they are somehow, yeah, those are quartz, as if women buy cars and don't want to know whether it's got an engine or not. You know, that always seemed really flawed to me. But I wonder whether it's actually about the value and the build inside, and the assumption that it's only about the cosmetic exterior is what's holding that whole thing back.
Well, I feel like I struggle with this conversation about what women care about, because over the years, you know, I remember writing in 2002 a story about women. You know, they care about complications. They care about the mechanics of a piece. And it was a conversation that, you know, kept getting revived. Every 3 or 4 years, I'd write that same story. And then in their more candid moments, watchmakers would tell me, actually, they don't really care. You know, they really just care about a design. And honestly, I haven't been able to get a great read on what is actually true about what women want. Is it true that just all women want different things? You can't label them in one fell swoop. I mean, do you feel like that conversation about complications and mechanics appealing to women, is that just marketing talk, a way to sell more complicated pieces to women, or is that true?
I think women evolve just like everything else, and it's true that what does really, when you take a man, what does he have? A watch, maybe a ring, and not always, even if he's supposed to wear it. And that's it. Like, they don't have accessories. So watches have always been associated to the man's accessory, leaving women with everything else. When we have a lot to talk about, we have jewelry, we have purses, we have things for our hair. So we have plenty of ways to decorate ourselves. However, women today have a buying power that they didn't used to have. So the man would buy something for the woman that would be completely irrelevant to him as far as what's inside, just to decorate his woman. But today a woman is not depending on a man to give her a watch. And like you mentioned cars earlier, I mean, I see women driving Porsche 911. They look so hot. You don't have to be a man to, right? You don't have to be a man to be like badass.
No,
so,
the opposite.
And I think that a woman wearing a watch that is not meant for a woman, that is not that little thing with little diamonds and that is like stamped, this is a watch for a woman, is badass. And today women are becoming more and more badass. So that's, you know, it's an evolution.
Well, taking your analogy with the cars, I mean, I think, you know, somebody could buy a car because they need to go from A to B every day, and that car does that job for them. Same with a watch. You need to know what time it is every day, and the watch does that job for you. What that watch looks like to you, what that car looks like to you, is up to you. So as a person who loves the color red, then you're going to buy something with a red dial. Or so I think it runs the gamut. And I don't think, for some women, they're probably very happy to have quartz. I mean, we all know what the value is of a mechanical watch, but for the average person, even if it's a very beautiful jewelry watch, they're great. They're happy to take it out of the safe and have it still be on time and running.
Well, you're the head of complications, so
Yeah, I mean, this is it. People are confusing the desirability with the potential for sellout, and there's a huge difference. Just because something might be niche, something might not have the volume of sales, doesn't mean it's any less important or the people buying those are any less passionate. So the brands who try and then stop, who test and then pull away, again, tend to be brands who have pressures from being publicly traded entities that have to meet sales figures. When you look at the independent brands, when you look at Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe, for example, these two brands, both independent, there's never been a break of producing complications for women. And the history of complications on wristwatches, by the way, evolved from women's pendant watches. Make no mistake about it. The first minute repeating wristwatches for men were recased women's pendant watches. That's the shift from the 1890s to the 1910s. So the whole history of complicated wristwatches for men are the evolution of the woman's pendant watch. So there's this confusion that takes place in the market. They're not selling well. No, you produce too many. There's a huge difference to that. For the brands that are controlling their production, you grow that market appropriately, and you grow it the right way, and you take the feedback from the collectors, and it really, really shows a very, very different face. And Patek and Audemars, these two brands, independent, are very, very strong with women's complications, and always have been.
I try to think about other industries and how they're approaching this conversation about gender. And Nick and I briefly chatted about fashion. I think of the toy market really as something that still very much is segregated. You know, girls' toys, boys' toys. You don't get as much. Well, perhaps that conversation has entered that industry, but I feel like, what other industries do you think still cling to these perhaps outdated notions of gender? And then Nick, I'd love you to just mention what you think the fashion industry is, how it's approaching this conversation.
Well, I think an area that we can see is very divided is cosmetics. And I've been thinking about this the other day, because you go into your CVS and there's rows and rows of Clairol hair color and all of this, and it's always women. And then there's the hair club for men, or just for men, you know, gray hair.
I wore eyeliner to a Jane's Addiction concert in 1991.
Awesome.
So that was my
awesome.
one makeup experience.
Right. But what I'm saying is, okay, probably it's the same thing inside of these boxes, but a man's, they're marketing these products to men, and somehow it makes them feel better about dyeing their hair or whatever it is, different deodorants, lots of cosmetic, skincare for men, a men's moisturizer for their face, a woman's moisturizer, that kind of thing. So that's an industry that I see is really very gender specific.
That's a good point.
Well, it's very true. I mean, we do a lot on Esquire about grooming products, and we always do it with sort of one eye shut, and in the sense that we don't think that it's a bad thing, skincare. It's a really good thing, but we wonder whether these men's products are actually just repackaged women's products with a slightly different smell in them. And if all the 27 men's shampoos on that, if they're all actually different shampoos, was a little suspicious of that, but we've seen an explosion in we're way beyond eyeliner, I can tell you. Me not, but we're on like face masks and hyaluronic acid and all of that. And as you can tell, I'm not the one who writes about it. But we are way behind, and I don't think we're ever going to reach some sort of parity. I just don't think that men think about it as much. But they are now knowing that they can. It's become much, much more normal for regular guys to do a bit of that.
Agreed. One thing, and sorry, we're jumping around a lot, and I will leave a few minutes left for questions, by the way, so please, start cooking up your questions. Sophie, you brought up MB&F, and I realized when I think about those really micro-brand, kind of unconventional watchmakers that are independents, that are doing kind of wild experimental pieces, I really do not think of them as making watches for women at all, or as women in any way being encouraged to buy them, either through their marketing or just through their positioning. And I wonder why that is. Why is it that these watches, it's perhaps because of their size, certainly in MB&F's case.
I think it's okay. I think it's fine. I have no problem for a brand to market to a certain category. It's good. Good for them. I think that Max is doing a fantastic job.
Sure, yeah.
And I think a man wearing an MB&F is really saying something. Same with Urwerk and all these big products. But then you have a brand like Beauvais, for example, that does beautiful, talking about complications, beautiful watches, beautiful complications. They're fairly wide and fairly large, but they also manage to make it so a woman can wear it. And it's like you were talking about the pendants. It's exactly it. Like you have a watch that is that you can wear on the wrist and then that you can wear as a necklace. It's very feminine, but it has some codes that are gender neutral. So I don't mind at all a brand that does specifically women-oriented watches or men-oriented watches. I think it's okay. At the end of the day, I think a woman is going to choose what she wants. And I think if a man wants to wear diamonds, good for him. You know, I think we need to be more democratic about it.
And I think it comes with time as well. I mean, look at Richard Mille. Richard Mille was exclusively men's watches for a very long time. As the company started to grow, as their fan base grew, they were able to stretch into women's watches. So I think some of the micro independents where you're producing 300, 400, 500 watches a year, you have these, you really have to build the company strategically. And then when you get to that next threshold, you start opening up the product mix further. And I think that's it would be amazing to see Max do some smaller versions of those watches, and maybe that will come in time.
I think he's working on something like this.
It sounds like inside info.
Yeah, maybe.
I hope, yeah. I mean, I'd love to see what an MB&F in a smaller, more feminine style looks like. I have a hard time imagining that.
I don't know if it will be smaller. I'm not sure it will be smaller, but I know he's cooking something that will be more female friendly.
Okay.
And we're seeing also women, like with Grubel Force made a smaller watch. Lange has smaller models now, and there are several women collectors who I know were very happy to now be able to acquire a Grubel Force potentially that can fit on their wrist comfortably.
Do you think part of that is just the obsession with all things vintage we're seeing, and so this being reflected in just smaller watches, given that vintage styles were so much smaller than contemporary models had become, that now it's easier for a woman to wear a piece inspired by a vintage model? Is that part of it?
I wanted to just backtrack a tiny bit that I think that the MB&Fs of this world and the Urwerks of this world are by their nature unique, and I don't think they even particularly market to men. I think they just market to crazy people who love that stuff. And I don't even think in their heads there is a sexual divide in that when they're doing it. I just think they took a lot of LSD and got a lot of precious metal and just went to town on it. But that said, the reduced size, I think that also appeals to men, because I think there are men who love those watches who would just rather they were just a little bit smaller than their car. And so it does favor women, and absolutely, and it's great that they're buying it, but I don't think it's just an advantage for women. But I think the vintage thing is also definitely, we went through this arc from like sort of 95 when Panerai came out that just pushed watches bigger and bigger, and then we went to the T3, which was a great moment, but it took a long time for it to ebb away, but we're still seeing 43, 44 and exceptionally large ones. But there is definitely now, when you buy a vintage watch now, I bought a 36 millimeter Universal 10 years ago, and it was too small for me to get my head around wearing it.
And that was big when it was new.
But now, yeah. I mean, we have to remember a date just when it was new in the 70s, let's say, was not small. It was a normal size watch. But by 2001, it looked tiny by comparison. So size is definitely an issue.
Relative, yeah.
And I think it's about, we're deep in remix culture. We're deep in postmodern era now. I mean, it's a matter of just choice now. Everything is welcome. Everything is a possibility. Everything can be pulled from. And that's goes back to the original discussion that women can wear things from as small as a 24, 25 millimeter watch up to a 45 millimeter watch. Same thing with fashion. We pull from all over the timeline now. It used to be something was of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, very defined. Since the 21st century, a lot of those rules have been totally thrown out the window. We pull from the timeline without thinking about it, not just within watches, not just within fashion or with motor cars. This is part of the modern era. This is part of this reality that the whole history of humanity is at our fingertips. We're the first generation in civilization where we can pull from a timeline without hesitation. And we're just in the infancy of seeing what this means across industries. The watch industry is only one of those, but we're seeing it across the whole spectrum.
I could listen to you for hours. Keep talking.
No, I mean, all really great insights, and all feel really, really sort of spot on.
Can I ask a question of the women on the panel? Because I think it's what I was saying right at the beginning. It's not necessarily the intention of the watch companies, or they need to look at that. But I think it's between the making of the watch and the selling of the watch is all the marketing of the watch and the ad campaigns and the testimonials from Hollywood stars and everything. How do you feel that affects this sort of gender divide in terms of watchmaking?
Well, for example, when Lady Gaga became the ambassador of Tudor, to me it was a complete disconnect. I didn't see anything in that partnership that made sense. You agree? Nothing. Lady Gaga is not the profile for Tudor. So to me, you bring an ambassador like this, it's meaningless. It's not going to make me want to buy the watch.
If they were to pick a different woman to be an ambassador for Tudor, who would you have suggested?
Me.
Yeah.
We knew you were going to say that.
You know who popped in my head, and only because I recently saw she's playing Captain America as soon as Brie Larson. She's playing
Captain Marvel, yeah.
Captain Marvel, sorry, not Captain America.
Comic book nerd.
Right. I don't know. I don't know who makes sense for Tudor, but I agree with you. Lady Gaga doesn't feel... Dior comes to mind.
I've never seen her wear a Tudor, ever.
She just...
Except when she had to take pictures.
Yeah.
It really only works when the celebrity has a genuine love and passion for the product. We were lucky with Serena Williams. Serena loved our watches long before the relationship. It's genuine, it's real, so it has to be organic or natural, to your point, Sophie. It has to be real.
Yeah. I think Omega's very long-standing relationship with Cindy Crawford is somewhat unique in that area. I mean, she's a model, and she's now working a lot with charitable efforts around the world. But we've seen a very long time where she's been associated with the Omega brand.
Is it Kate Winslet with long jeans as well? Is it that one? That's been
Yes.
very long, right?
I don't know how long that's been, actually. I'm not sure. And then you have Kate Blanchett, who does Omega, I believe. Or IWC, sorry. So, yeah, anyway, I think, the celebrity angle works, and I think when it's a long-term relationship, I think that just adds to the feeling that it's real, as like you were saying, Michael. Yeah.
Well, let's see. We're sort of coming up on our time, but, well, for that matter, does anybody in the audience have any questions? Justin?
There's a mic coming.
Great. Is it on?
Oh, there we go. Sorry. So this has been a really interesting kind of look at this dialogue at a more philosophical level. But what do you guys think about how this positioning of the different segments actually impacts sales? Like, someone walks in the door with an interest in a particular watch. Go to a salesperson. Like, case in point, I was a big fan of the Breitling Transocean 38 chrono that was around for years, and that was always positioned as a women's watch. But say if a friend of mine sees it on me, doesn't know anything about watches, walks into the boutique, goes to the random guy that's selling that day, like, oh well, no, that's a woman's watch. Like, do you think you see that in? Is there data behind that there's an audience is being alienated, and it's the same thing on the women's side. Like, oh well, let me show you the pretty things with diamonds on them.
It's certain brands do a much better job at training their boutique staff to be enthusiastic to show whatever watch that client comes in wanting to see. And as well, if you're a really good salesperson, you're also going to be showing other options along those lines as well. When somebody asks for one watch, you want to show them 3 or 5. You want to bring a couple trays out. You want to give them that ability to try things on, because the tactile experience is a massive impact about with the wearing of watches. Not just how it looks, but also how it feels as well. Some brands do that a lot better than others, and you make a really good point, and that's something that the brands really should hear more of. And it's something that we've had to learn at Audemars Piguet. We weren't good at this 10 years ago. We were not good at this. We had to listen to people like you. We had to listen to customers and retool the way that we interact with clients at the boutique level. And we've gotten better at it, but we have to be constantly going around and training. And it's something that comes up in our international seminars as well. You remember when we were in Oman, this was a discussion at our seminars that don't assume a watch is for a specific individual, and also people shop for other people. The notion that the man is the shopper is this came up in the panel yesterday. Women have the buying power these days. I don't know about you, man, but I can't go buy a watch without checking with my fiance. Are you kidding? Like, you know, it really is a family decision, is what was used yesterday, and I'm borrowing that from someone else. But it really is a family decision these days, which really means it's you know, it's the significant other's decision. Often it's the case. But coming in and asking for something along those lines, and then seeing how the brands react. When we launched the frosted gold, we thought of it as a feminine aesthetic. The designer Caroline Bucci had done the jewelry for women, but men were really interested in it as well. So now we've released it in the 41 millimeter as well. Not big production numbers, but that was an aesthetic that we really assumed would be for women, and we were wrong. Men wanted it, and we've produced it.
That's a great question. One thing I should say is I also think that it'll take, it still feels like it'll take time before retailers who have, especially multi-brand retailers who really are the gatekeepers, or for a long time were the gatekeepers of this industry, to change their sort of more conventional views on how to sell these things, and to Michael's point, to train their sales staff to be less, make less sort of presumptuous kind of comments about what their clients want.
I was going to come back to your friend going into the Breitling boutique, and that's in the women's section. As a woman, I feel that it would be easier for me to go to the men's section than for a man to go to the women's section. Do you agree?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, because you know, somehow a man's masculinity is threatened if he's walking over to the ladies' side.
We're weak. We are the weaker species when it comes to that, without a doubt.
Totally. I mean, I do think that we know how lucky we are, because we walk into a shop that has 52 watches for us, and there may well be 2 on the other side that we should look at, but we've got plenty to look at, you know. And if you're a woman who's interested in the possibilities of men's watches, you do have to cross the divide in a way. And I do think that the closer you get to the customer, the more things have to change, in a way, because if you know, there's one rule about retail: if you don't offer it to someone, they can't buy it. But if you do, they might. You know, if they don't know it's there, and if they also don't know that it's completely normal for them to want to buy a men's, what was traditionally called a men's watch, you almost have to overstate it.
The irony is, 100 years ago was the total opposite. It was watches were the extra things inside the jewelry store. You know, the women would go to the jewelry store, and the men, oh, have a look at these few watches. And that's really the evolution of the early multi-brand stores. They emerged out of the jewelry industry, not the other way around.
That's interesting. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Let's see, do we have a mic that we can? Oh, just over there, yep.
Hi, quick question regarding unisex watches. So, you know, we all have been talking about men's watches, women's watches, and so on. But the Tudor Black Bay 36, for example, when it came out, at least my humble impression was that it was somewhat touted as a unisex watch. It could go either way. But now I'm seeing Tudor has a 32 millimeter Black Bay and a 41. Is it that manufacturers are afraid of making a unisex watch because they think they may alienate one or maybe both genders who may be looking at the watch for purchase. So they're making specifics.
I think so. I think that there is a fear of missing out on sales, and that the manufacturers are trying to accommodate all sizes and all tastes on the spectrum. Sometimes it's ridiculous. Sometimes you have like a 36, 37, 38, 39, and then 41. I mean, it's too much. And to your point, overproduction has been a problem in this industry. And what you're mentioning is probably also part of the problem. And sometimes brands need to take a stand. A 36 millimeters is fine for a man and a woman, and if a man doesn't like it, he can get the 40. But you don't have to go for like 5 different sizes that follow each other.
And if the brand tries something like that and they produce too many, it's the aftermath that impacts the whole brand perception, because they end up getting discounted, they end up on the gray market, and they end up affecting the whole perceived value of the brand. So they want to be less risky. They want to find those pockets that are a little less risky. And again, it's the public, the big brands, the big family brand, not the family brands, the conglomerates. They do amazing things. They have incredible R&D money. They are amazing movements. To be part of the groups has its advantages. But as I said earlier, the disadvantage is in that shareholder scenario, they have to be really, really cautious to not only meet those numbers, but they have to grow. It's quarterly earnings. And certain industries lend themselves to quarterly earnings. The watch industry, this is a long game. These are objects of permanence in an era of obsolescence. So you end up with discord sometimes between the strategy of the watch company and the pressures that they have from their shareholders. And again, it's not better or worse. I'm in a family-run business. I mean, Jasmine Audemars, the great-granddaughter of Jules Audemars, she's the chairwoman of the company. We're in a different situation. We're lucky to be in that situation. Sometimes I feel for my friends who are in those big groups because of those pressures that are haunting them in the background. And decisions have to be made to align with those strategic needs.
Well said. Thank you. Did you want to comment? No, or, do we have any? I think we probably have time for one more question. Yeah.
Hi. So sorry, that was too loud. Thank you guys for being on the panel. It's very informative, so I just want to thank you guys. I just had a question going to the first gentleman's question, maybe a follow-up, which is from your experience and from what you're seeing in terms of these watchmakers doing innovative things and trying to both sell to men and women, unisex, what have you, how does geography play in that? So I'm somewhat new to Miami. I used to live in New York City for 12 years. Mr. Sullivan, I'm a huge fan of yours, by the way, and I've read so many of your articles, so it's a pleasure sort of seeing you here in person for the first time.
I'm nerding out a little bit over here, too.
Right,
I'm trying to be cool. I'm hoping he notices my jacket.
But even between New York City and Manhattan, for example, and Miami, at least from some friends that are, you know, both male and female, there's a different sort of aesthetic, a different maybe appreciation. I wonder, from your perspective, not with, you know, within the United States, within Europe, within Asia, how does that affect consumers' understanding about watches, men, women, unisex, or what have you?
Well, in Asia, definitely you will have smaller sizes, and men will have no problem wearing 34 millimeters. And in Miami, it doesn't happen. I don't think so, unless you're into vintage watches, and in that case, you would embrace a smaller size. But I think that your point is on point, because geography is definitely a factor. Europeans are more subdued than Americans. South Americans are like wearing like giant sizes, and that's why some brands like Roger Dubuis did a killing when South America was you know, economically able of buying a lot of watches. Russians, look at Ulysse Nardin, is doing or was doing great in Russia, and the sizes were exactly what the Russians wanted, because it's a culture that likes to show. So when you're European or Asian, there is more discretion that is kind of, you know, the value of the culture. And when you're in the US or in even Middle East, you tend to wear bigger size and want to be seen more. I don't know if that answers your question. So for men and women, it comes to the same thing. You will probably have women wear bigger watches and more visible, maybe blinger watches here and in South America than you would in Europe.
And brands have to be fluid. Brands have to be, they have to have a business strategy to move the property where it's popping in different markets. And the brands that are built that way are the ones who are going to have an easier time with their sellout and making those numbers. And that needs to be a strategy for brands. So in other words, if a certain size or a certain aesthetic is moving in one area and slow in another, they have to have that ability to shift the inventories over to the area that it's selling. And we've been through this. We had a 33 millimeter quartz Royal Oaks, the two-tone. It was really quiet in some markets and really, really loud in others. So the following year, we shifted the allocations around, moved the product where it was selling. And when they dried up in the area, then all of a sudden people wanted it again. But you have to be fluid and you have to move and you have to be really on the pulse. And that's what's tough for the Swiss watch industries, is being on the pulse. They're used to a history of keeping things in boxes, delivering it as such. And they have to learn to be a little more American, to be, you know, to bob and weave a little bit. And they're starting to get better at it.
What, you're saying being American is better?
Being fluid. Being fluid.
Well, I think we're just about at our time, so thank you so much for this more enlightening than I thought it could be conversation. So really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Yay. Well, enjoy the rest of Watches and Wonders.